So here we have video 5 for the course entitled Learning for Life and Study Skills, which covers the topics of critical reading and critical thinking. So first of all, we need to start thinking about what critical thinking can and can't be. So first of all, it's best to think of critical thinking as a process of learning. It's not something that's very concrete or linear, and it can't be explained as a simple algorithm or step-by-step approach, because it tends to be a series of processes, skills, techniques, approaches, and methods that are related to the context in which you're working. That can be an organizational context, it can be an academic, a theoretical, and so on and so forth. So it's not one thing really. The key thing here is that it's always about personal change and development. It's an internal process that we go through in our brains, in our minds, that's executed in some way in some work that we're doing. Also bear in mind that there are various terms that are often used to explain critical thinking that have some other uses or meanings or origins. A good example is evaluation. We can say that evaluation is a key part of critical thinking, but that term is also used to mean specific other things in research and academia. Now, that's a bit confusing, of course, but just bear that in mind, that the same sorts of words can be used in different places, in different contexts, meaning slightly different things, but there's some core meaning for that term. So evaluation means reflecting on something and assessing it. So just to bear in mind, the words we use to talk about all this do have that kind of complexity. And finally, just to say, in addition to that, there are various different ways of explaining critical thinking, and it's best to actually explain it from different points of view, and therefore this explanation requires some degree of repetition. So just to warn you, that's going to happen in this fairly short video. Hopefully it won't be too repetitive. So here we're going to talk a little bit about critical reading as one aspect to this whole area of how you do critical thinking. So this has more practical implications, I think, so it's a good starting point to start to explain it. And critical reading has strong links with critical thinking. So when you're doing critical reading, you are also effectively either doing or preparing for critical thinking. And critical reading is also a set of techniques and approaches and ways of thinking that you develop to structure ideas for an essay, for example. But it can also help you organize your notes and record your reflections on the information or the ideas or the text or the academic materials that you're exposed to. So in order to describe and explain what critical reading that's linked to critical thinking might be, think about how you absorb, how you experience, how you absorb, how you exercise your judgment of information or text or research material. Do you take it at face value? Do you read something and think, oh, that's absolutely true? Because if you did, then what if you read something that said something different? So critical reading is not taking things at face value while you're absorbing them. It's actually being more reflective, if you like. And what you need to aim for here is ways of understanding the author's interpretation and opinions. So first of all, you need to understand what they're saying before you then go on to compare it to what other people are saying. And different authors will naturally not only have different perspectives, but they'll have different paradigms. They'll have different ways of explaining things. They'll use different theories and different language. So you've got to absorb all of that and understand where that comes from in order to understand what the author's saying. So you need to understand different viewpoints so that you can make your own judgments based on that. And one of the key things here is that you start, bearing in mind all of this is a process, to look for limitations in the material that you're write down your reflections so that you don't lose your natural ability to reflect on what you're reading. So in order to describe and explain what critical reading that's linked to critical thinking might be, think about how you absorb, how you experience, how you absorb, how you exercise your judgment of information or text or research material. Do you take it at face value? Do you read something and think, oh, that's absolutely true? Because if you did, then what if you read something that said something different? So critical reading is not taking things at face value while you're absorbing them. It's actually being more reflective, if you like. And what you need to aim for here is ways of understanding the author's interpretation and opinions. So first of all, you need to understand what they're saying before you then go on to compare it to what other people are saying. And different authors will naturally not only have different perspectives, but they'll have different paradigms. They'll have different ways of explaining things. They'll use different theories and different language. So you've got to absorb all of that and understand where that comes from in order to understand what the author's saying. So you need to understand different viewpoints so that you can make your own judgments based on that. And one of the key things here is that you start, bearing in mind all of this is a process, to look for limitations in the material that you're looking at, omissions, things that are missed out, inconsistencies, say for example in the way they explain things or present their arguments. What are they not saying? What are they not explaining? How is what they're saying not really enough to answer the questions maybe that they might pose at the beginning? So all of this is what you do when you start to read something. It doesn't finish after you've finished reading. It's a process, and it starts when you start to read material, because you've got to read it and pick out these things as you're going along, make notes on it, write down your reflections so that you don't lose your natural ability to reflect on what you're reading. So, put another way, critical reading is not just about being critical of the text. It's not just about seeing ideas and arguments or pieces of writing that you're experiencing as somehow faulty or flawed. It's linked to critical thinking, so it's about engaging in what you read and asking yourself questions such as, well, what is the author really trying to say here? What's the main argument being presented? And where do these ideas come from, and what do they actually mean? What's the context to them? Because it's when you build up that kind of deep understanding from reading that you're starting to develop critical thinking. I think it's really useful and important to try and link some of this to the way in which you would actually handle information when we're reading, because that's when you start to organize existing ideas and your own ideas in a way that allows you to remember it. Of course, there's a memory issue here, but also to process that information critically. So first of all, it's very, very useful to pick out the key concepts and phrases or key words or paragraphs or chunks of text that are really important in a piece of writing that you're reading. So taking notes on those key phrases, key points, key sections is how you would structure and organize your thinking and your reading. So in order to really understand the whole piece, you need to understand some of those key concepts first, and then the context and rationale to it. So what does the concept of social class, for example, mean? Why do they use it in that way? What does it mean for them? Does it have a definition of some kind? You know, those sorts of thoughts. And you can always develop your thinking when you're reading by writing notes, questions, ask yourself questions, ask questions of the text, write those down as you're reading, and that will allow you to reflect both then and later on. Another good technique is to focus on the summaries or review material before tackling the more complex, detailed arguments. So one way of doing that would be to read the introduction to a piece first, then the conclusion at the end, and then go back and read the middle, which is the detailed argument later on, assuming it's structured in that way. Not all information will be. But understand the basic position of the author before you start to break it down further and understand it in more detail. So breaking the text into manageable chunks is the process of reviewing that you should undertake, and that would be very helpful. Another way of dealing with all the information that you've got in front of you is to do something called skimming and scanning. So what you do there is you quickly read the papers. Say it's 10 pages long, and that's quite a long piece and it's quite complex and dense. So what you can do is you could just read it really fast, take a highlighter and highlight the bits you don't understand or the bits you do understand that seem to be key, and then leave it and go back. And once you've understand the key points, it's much easier to go back and read it and understand the detail, as I've said before. And something else you should be aware of is to observe the difference or the similarity between academic and ordinary language and their meaning. So a word like evaluation, for example, you might say, oh, I'm going to evaluate a situation, or you're going to evaluate something you want to buy. But in academic language, that might mean a lot more. And so it's important to start to understand the meanings of terms that are used and the concepts that are presented to you. So another technique which is quite useful is paraphrasing. So sometimes it helps you to understand things better, or maybe it just helps you to write notes better, or maybe it allows you to write critical reflections better. But if you summarize what you've read in your own words, then that can help you reinforce the points that are being made by the author, but also help you to then say, well, what is it about this that I'm not comfortable with, that doesn't really sit well with me? So the objective of all of this is really to read and reflect on people's positions, on the positions of authors, and the evidence that they present to you as well, which is another whole area that's quite complex, is how do you review evidence? So that could be empirical evidence, it could be statistics, it could be other types of evidence. There might even be pictures or diagrams involved. So remember that all of this takes practice, and so some of these techniques that I'm suggesting here are in order for you to practice as well. Like, for example, paraphrasing is a way of practicing. That will help you when you come to write essays later on or summarize larger chunks of text. So we're basically slowly building up these techniques into a way that we can use them all together to achieve something. So to focus now more directly on critical thinking, we can say that it's about being open-minded, and also how you do that to process and analyze information and material that you're exposed to. It is about being rational, but at the same time as being aware of your own particular perspective and feelings on the subject. It's about being able to organize and reorganize thoughts, knowledge, and understanding into new ideas or viewpoints, including your own. So it's about developing your own viewpoint, which actually might be quite new. It might be something that hasn't been written down before, that you haven't read. Almost certainly it will be based on your evolving understanding of a field. And it's important to note that critical methods of doing and thinking are the foundations of true learning and personal development, which we've said before. And this is about presenting a reasoned argument of your own. It can be based on other people's, but it should also, in some circumstances, be something you've developed separately and independently from that in some respects, that evaluates, analyzes, and processes the sources and reading or information that you've included in your work. So another way of expressing some of this and expanding on that is to say that critical thinking skills can be about understanding the links and the differences between ideas and theories and where they come from. It's about determining and evaluating evidence, arguments, ideas, and positions. And this can involve identifying inconsistencies in reasoning or evidence. Running through all of this is the necessity to approach these logical problems in a consistent and systematic way. That's very important, and sometimes not something you read or you're made aware of during studying, but doing things systematically is very important because it makes you more inclusive and therefore more reflective ultimately. So self-reflection and the ways in which you justify your own assumptions, beliefs, and values is really crucial to critical thinking. And if you do that, you can recognize, build, and appraise from and within your own arguments. So you're building your own perspectives in these ways. So to go through this and try and pull some of this together and go over some of these things again, we'd like to say that skills for critical thinking are a varied set of skills which can include observation, analysis, reading, interpretation, reflection, explanation, extrapolation, and evaluation. And specifically, it's about moving towards thinking in an objective and so-called critical way, which is about identifying the different arguments related to a topic or an issue or a problem. And it's about evaluating the points of view that are involved in that problem or issue and looking at how strong or valid they are. It's about trying to uncover and recognize any weaknesses in the evidence or arguments that you're reviewing. And it's also about contextualizing the statements or arguments that you're reviewing to a particular cultural context, a political context, a theoretical context, an academic context, a social context. All of these things, of course, can be the same thing as well. They're not separate things, but, contextualizing what you're reading and what you're understanding and interpreting is really crucial. And at the end of the day, you're trying to provide structured reasoning in an argument that you're actually creating for your own purposes. So finally, just to kind of pull out some key things that I think are key things to remember and learn from all this is that critical thinking and, of course, critical reading is about evaluating information from different sources. It's about understanding different perspectives and the context to those. And it's about extrapolating and interpreting the consequences for the different positions that you're including in your reviews.